Fantastic. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our joint National Liberal Club Commonwealth Forum and European Forum event. We're absolutely delighted to have Baroness Kate Parminter with us tonight to discuss climate change and biodiversity, and how this year is one of great importance and opportunity. Before we get to that, however, let me take care of some housekeeping items. First, as many of you are aware, this event is being recorded, so please keep yourself on mute unless called on during our Q&A session. Baroness Parminter will be speaking for around 20 to 25 minutes, after which we'll open up for questions. If you do wish to ask a question, please send only to me in the chat. I might not pick it up if it's in the general discussion or chat that everybody's on. And I'll also ask you to please keep your question to just one question and be quick and concise, because I'm sure we're going to have a lot to get through in our limited time this evening. And then right at the end of the evening, Subbu Loganathan will give our concluding remarks and vote of thanks. So this evening's event is Climate Change and Biodiversity 2021, a year of opportunity. And what an opportunity the world has for 2021, both with the UN Biodiversity Conference, COP15 in Kunming, China in October, and the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, better known as COP26 in November. The evening's focus is on the upcoming challenges in ensuring global consensus on carbon reduction goals and biodiversity protection. So I've spoken enough. Let me introduce our guest speaker. Baroness Kate Parminter is the new chair of the Lords Select Committee on the Environment and Climate Change. In the past, she's worked for several companies, also heading the public affairs for the RSPCA, during which time she chaired the campaign for the protection of hunted animals, which helped ban hunting with dogs. She was also the chief executive of CPRE, a campaign to protect rural England for nearly 6 years. Kate was a Liberal Democrat councillor on Horsham District Council in West Sussex for 8 years, a member of the Liberal Democrat South East Region Executive, and was a member of the Liberal Democrats Federal Executive and the Federal Finance and Administration Committee. She is now a trustee of the party. Kate was created a life peer in 2010, and during her time in the Lords has campaigned on a diverse range of issues, including the environment, equality, animal welfare, and education. She successfully campaigned to introduce a 5p charge on plastic bag usage to reduce the over-reliance on a product that I think we all know is really incredibly damaging to the environment. In 2015, she was appointed to the House of Lords Select Committee on National Policy for the Built Environment. Since then, she's been the Liberal Democrat Environment, Food, and Rural Affairs spokesperson in the team led by Tim Farron. Outside of politics, Kate is a trustee of the think tank IPPR and is also a patron of Meath Epilepsy Trust. Baroness, thank you again for joining us this evening. We're all very excited to hear your talk.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Emily. I feel like my life has just flashed before me. But in this audience, where I can see a number of long-term friends, I think the one thing that wasn't said is that I do genuinely feel like tonight I'm speaking with friends rather than to friends, because I've been a member of the National Liberal Club for nearly 30 years. And my husband and I had our engagement party there back on the terrace in 1993. So my association with the club is much longer than my relatively recent, a mere decade in the House of Lords. But I'm delighted to have my new role there, which I've had now for a couple of weeks, and for this to be for one of my first external engagements, being able to wear that badge. So as Emily said, this year is going to be an absolutely crucial year, and indeed it's the start of a crucial decade, because the world has to act if we're going to put ourselves on a trajectory in order to tackle both the climate and the nature crisis that we face. So I want to talk about why COP26 and COP15 are critical. We hear quite a lot in the press about COP26, but not so much about COP15, but they are interlinked. So that's why I wanted to talk about both of them tonight, and what they need to achieve, and crucially, what our government can do to help make that a reality. So firstly, COP26, which, as Emily rightly said, is the 26th conference of the parties to the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it will be chaired by the UK, but also acting in collaboration with Italy. And I do want to come back to that point a bit later on in my remarks. And it's scheduled to take place in November, which I think everybody knows. It's postponed from last year. I had a high-level briefing yesterday. They are still working to the the remit that it will go ahead. They're obviously making contingency plans, but as of yesterday, they're still planning to have a physical conference. We may wish to come back to that in comments at the end. So why is action needed? Well, we all know 2020, according to the scientists, was one of the warmest on records. We had wildfires, we had droughts, we had storms, and we had glacial melt intensifying hugely. And indeed, the year before, in 2019, scientists told us that our total greenhouse gas emissions, including those from land use change, reached a new high of 59.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. And I'm not going to give many statistics, but that's going to be one of the ones that I hold very dear to my heart. I mean, it's that high. So what do we need COP to do? Well, firstly, we need to build on the Paris Agreement. And I did want to spend a little bit of time going back, because for people like us who are liberals and internationalists and in favour of working together, I think we need to celebrate the fact that Paris was such a massive achievement in terms of global governance. Making global progress on issues is fraught with difficulties, but Paris was a seminal success, both in terms of what it delivered for climate and what it showed was possible in terms of delivering international global governance together. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the success of that, but I just did want to flag that we need to reflect on what we achieved at Paris. The fact that world leaders came together to agree that they wanted to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees, above pre-industrial levels, and ideally to limit the temperature rise to 1.5, because everybody was telling them, and we all know that limiting to 1.5 gives us a substantial benefit to limit the damage both to people and to ecosystems, and gives us the room to adapt and remain below the risk thresholds. So Paris created a new system where countries made pledges to implement these agreements through what were called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, which set national targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by either 2025 or 2030. And they are reviewed periodically through a stocktake process, through which the impacts of the pledges are added up and they're compared against the trajectory to which we need to go to hit the 1.5 or the 2 degrees target. And the size of the gap between the pledges in the NDCs and the emissions reductions needed is therefore hoped to spur countries to increase their pledges in successive NDCs. Now that sounded a bit techie, but it's really important because what we're having in Glasgow in November is the first time that we'll see the ratcheting up mechanism of those NDCs and whether or not this new approach does work. And we've really got to hope that it does work, because frankly, in the past, what they've tried is a top-down approach. They tried that in the Kyoto Protocol and they tried that in the Copenhagen 2019 COP. And top-down has failed. They could not get agreement when you do a top-down approach. And Paris was a recognition that they couldn't get a top-down approach, and it was about bottom-up. And it's worked so far, but we need to prove at Glasgow that this bottom-up approach can work. So the size of the challenge, well, it's massive, because the government pledges in those aforementioned NDCs are still woefully inadequate. And when the UN Environment Programme published its emissions gap, which it does yearly, it did that, I think, in December, in assessing the size of the gap between what's on offer and what we need to get, then it showed absolutely clearly that we're way off target. And it predicted that the emissions level will leave us on a trajectory for 3.2 increase. And that's even if all the unconditional NDCs are fully implemented. And several of those are conditional on development aid. So that's the bad news. But the good news as we approach COP is that this reality, this announcement by the UN Environment Programme of the gap between what's been promised and what's needed, it does seem to have stimulated further action, which is frankly the way a bottom-up approach is supposed to work. So we're doing reasonably well in terms of testing out the mechanisms so far. As I'm sure many of you will have noticed, in April, in the in the run up to COP, we've already had the Americans make a massively increased pledge to what was there, certainly under the non-pledge under Trump, but even under the previous President Obama, with the US now pledging 50 to 52% emissions reductions from 2005 level by 2030. I think under Obama it was something like a 26% reduction. So it is a whopping new pledge, which the new president has committed America to. The UK, I'll come on to in a moment, but the EU pledged an increase in emissions with an emissions reduction of at least 55% below 1990 levels by 2030. And that's an increase up from 40% before. And Japan, another big hitter, pledged a 46% reduction 2030, which was a substantial increase on its previous target of 20%. And critically, for all of us, because they account for nearly 30% of emissions, China has pledged that they will start phasing out coal between 2026 and 2030. Yeah, that's 2030. But we need those emissions to peak by 2030. And I think that's why we've seen so much activity by John Kerry and going to China, trying to get the Chinese to commit on the issue of coal. It's a critical issue, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But equally, it's key, I think, for the success of this event that there is a clear, close working together of the Americans and the Chinese. So that investment of diplomatic work by John Kerry is to be welcomed. But it's sadly not all good. It's no surprise that President Bolsonaro in Brazil has recently repeated a commitment to end illegal deforestation by 2030, but it's conditional, completely conditional on receiving £1 billion per year in international finance, which some would say is blackmail. Others would say is a legitimate approach. You can probably guess where I stand on that. And equally, there's now legislation going through the lower house in the Brazil parliament, which will undermine any efforts to curb illegal deforestation. And we need Brazil to be on side because the Amazon are the lungs of the world. We need strong and enforceable action in Brazil. But it's not just Brazil. Australia, once again, has confirmed its status as a climate outlier by committing to absolutely nothing new. And India, which is the third largest polluter in the world, really, I mean, it's the way they received John Kerry. He wasn't received particularly well. And the progress they've offered is slow and small, I think is how I would categorise it. But we are liberals. We are, or whether it's small L or large L, I'm not sure, I can't speak for all of you, but liberals are optimists by nature. So why can I be helpful? Well, effectively, overall, 127 countries have now aimed to achieve net zero emissions by the mid-century, something which was considered completely unrealistic just a few years ago. So that is something to hold on to. If achieved globally, and it's a massive, massive if, even for most of them to be achieved in those 127 countries, even if that is accompanied by stringent near-term reductions, which aren't yet in place, it means these actions could be in line with the 1.5 degrees target. And frankly, that's what we've really got to be hoping for. So 1.5 is close to impossible, but not impossibly so, I would argue. And 2% is still very challenging, but definitely not impossible. I think that's how I'd categorise it. So what will be good outcomes from COP26? Well, my good outcomes are slightly different to the outcomes that the government have set for themselves. Firstly, we need a number of governments to pledge tougher emission cuts by 2030. We need more ambition. Secondly, we need a number of governments to publish really clear plans to reach net zero emissions by 2030. At the moment, a lot of countries do not have the internal capacity to draw up and show clear plans for how they're going to reach it. So we need that to happen at the end of COP. And thirdly, the critical issue on this issue, as with so many other international areas, we need the richer nations to pledge, and even to fulfil their pledge really, to deliver the least £1 billion per annum which was committed to at Paris to help poorer ones protect themselves against climate impacts and speed up efforts for decarbonisation. So that issue of finance I wanted to touch on because it's always so key. As I said, 2020 was the year, obviously it's been moved now forward to 2021 given the postponement, but it was the year when the wealthy nations were due to deliver the target of £100 billion in climate finance. And that was agreed as far back as Copenhagen in 2009. The difficulty is it's really hard to know whether that target has been met. The 2009 pledge stated, and I quote, "This funding will come from a wide variety of sources, public and private, bilateral and multilateral, including alternative sources of finance." So frankly, no clear sense of where the money was coming from. And equally, it specified no rules as what could be counted in those categories. And some of those are not tracked with anywhere near enough precision in the individual countries to know what the outcome is. Now, the OECD, some of you may know, has calculated that £79 billion has been delivered in 2018. I think it would be fair to say there's a fair degree of scepticism, both among a lot of countries and indeed NGOs, and critically the developing countries, about both the methodology and the totals. So what do we need? Well, before we get to COP, the critical building block is the upcoming G7 next month, which is still planned to be going ahead in Cornwall. And that's where we've got to see decisive action and progress on hitting that $1 billion, not pounds, pledge. We need the rich countries to actually step up in advance of COP and begin the process of ramping up the climate finance. And that's absolutely critical for the long-term credibility of COP. And given the climate impacts are severely exacerbated in poorer nations by the crippling impact of COVID-19, we need those richer nations to offer support for poorer nations in the form of debt relief, access to IMF funds via special drawing down rights, and indeed more innovative tools such as debt and climate swaps, whereby the cost of climate action can be written off from existing debt obligations. Now, there's been some progress in the lead up to the G7 about this. Some of you will have seen in April, the US Secretary Janet Yellen brought together leaders of private and multilateral development banks to underline the importance of refocusing global finance. And Matt Carney has set up a new initiative called the Global Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is about bringing together 160 financial institutions managing, I think it's $70 trillion of assets together to drive finance mobilisation. And again, last week, Lord Stern produced a new report which was requested by the UK government. It's not adopted by them, but requested by them, outlining how those richer countries could support poorer countries through delivery of this critical £1 billion financing. So there is some progress in advance of G7, but not yet enough. So finance is a critical issue. And the other critical issue that I would say needs even more focus is the issue of coal, which I mentioned in terms of China, which is one of the biggest emitters of coal-fired powered stations and is indeed planning more of them. The UK government has said that they want to see a target by 2030 that 2/3 of coal production will be falling. And some of you may have seen yesterday that, fantastically surprisingly, the International Energy Agency said that they thought that coal targets need to be reduced by 90% by 2025. I have to say that's not something I ever expected the International Energy Agency to say, but that was the conclusion they reached and released yesterday. But as I say, there are new plants still being planned. It is to be remembered that the UK government themselves, who, despite the fact that they're leading on the alliance to phase out coal, was trying earlier on in the year to allow a new coal mine in Cumbria. It is to be applauded that at long last they have seen the light and are bringing that into a public inquiry. But as it stands at the moment, that is still not off the table. So we need more action on coal. We need more people actually following the recent example of Korea, who have recently said that they are going to stop financing new coal-powered installations. So that's some good news from Korea. So is the UK in a good position to deliver a good outcome at COP26? Well, on the one hand, yes. Earlier this year, the UK government signed up to this new target of 78% of an emissions reduction by 2035, consistent with net zero by 2050. And that is world leading and a fantastic step forward. So yes, that's good. And the mechanisms set up in the Climate Change Act back in 2008 rather, have for a long time been recognised as a good model for translating ambition into targets which can then be monitored over time. So yes, the government has stepped up in terms of ambition, and historically we've got a good model about how we manage our delivery from ambition through to to meeting the targets. And we've also got, and it shouldn't be underestimated, and some of you on this webinar will be only too familiar, we have the advantage of a very good diplomatic service, and the FCDO are fully behind supporting the government in delivering the targets of COP. So there's some good things, but there's a lot of things where we need to worry. Firstly, the UK is not on track to meet its own carbon budget commitments for the mid-2020s, let alone the 2030s. So far, most of the progress in reducing emissions has come from power generation, but with coal virtually eliminated now in the UK, further progress is going to be a lot slower, and very little has been done to tackle emissions in heating, in transport, aviation or agriculture. And frankly, whilst we welcome the government's commitment on meeting the 6th carbon budget, the government hasn't said how they're going to deliver it. And they've said that they don't accept all of the Climate Change Committee's recommendations, but they haven't said which, and they haven't said what the alternatives are. So again, it's one of those things where they're good on ambition, but there's no clear follow through into how it's going to be delivered. Equally, if we look back, even over the last 6 months, whilst you could argue that BEIS and DEFRA have been doing some good things on the climate, there's been a whole series of other initiatives which have seriously constrained our ability to meet our climate objectives. There's the cutting of the overseas aid budget, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. We've scrapped the Green Homes grant scheme, and there's nothing to replace it, and yet we know that homes account for, I think it's 60%, it's definitely 16% of our UK total greenhouse gas emissions. We have granted new licences for oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. We are approving more airport expansions. Regional airports like Southampton have been given the go-ahead to expand. And we've seen cuts in support to electric vehicles and grants for people who want to buy them. So a whole host of things which just show climate ambition is not yet fully embedded across all government decisions. And those things are noticed. They really are noticed by other countries. And there are 2 other things where I think we need to worry. The first is we can't avoid the fact that we had Brexit. Now, we are arguing our position. We're in a slightly stronger position in terms of ambition of the EU, but we don't have the weight of that EU bloc as we go into this critical global event. And also we have to say that we also have to counter the international perception of the UK, which Brexit fostered, which was all about a retreat from the global position back into, we're okay, Jack, the rest of you can, sort this out on yourself. So Brexit does play into the COP26 quite strongly. Now, whilst one could argue that because we're co-chairing with Italy, it's less of an issue than it would be because there's a close association, I don't think that counters it entirely. And even if one were to be charitable and say, we could do this well on our own, we can manage the negotiations, where I think because of being outside Europe, we are absolutely nowhere near as in a strong position, is how we then deliver our climate ambitions. We no longer are part of things like what was Horizon 2020, when you have people working together to collectively solve problems, the R&D that's going to be needed in new technologies, the whole issue around carbon border adjustments if you're going to deal with globalized footprints. We are in a weaker position outside Europe than we were in, sadly, is what I should have said. And finally, the other thing where I think we're at a disadvantage is we've got Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. One only has to remember we had the Leaders' Summit in America in April, which was a fantastic initiative by Joe Biden, stepping up to the plate, promising more investment, global leadership, bringing everyone together. And what was the comment that everyone remembers about our Prime Minister? That this isn't an issue for bunny huggers. I mean, it just sort of, there was a crassness which really goes to the heart of his own personal style, which, and you have to remember, he is going to be one of the lead figures driving this process forward. And I think you can't get away from that is not going to help us as we move forward onto this internationally critical conference. So what do we need from the government? And I need to speed up because I'm taking too long, so I apologise. Well, what we really need is we need them to reverse the cuts in the overseas aid budget. They try to tell us that, oh, of course, the climate element has been protected, but frankly, it is a retreat of global leadership, a comprehensive retreat of global leadership, and there is no one else in the G7 who will be able to step up to the plate to fill in the gap that our cut from 0.7 down to 0.5 will make. And it says if we can't be prepared to pay that, then how are we able to credibly lead as we try to steer the G7 through those very tricky talks about how the G7 countries support poorer developing countries. And secondly, we need this net zero strategy from the government now so that we can actually see how they plan to deliver this ambition, because otherwise it could just all be hot air from the Prime Minister. We need the net zero strategy, which has been promised. They keep saying it'll be advanced in COP, but we need it now. So in the remaining 5 minutes or so that I will now try and say a few words about COP15, because I do think it's not getting the coverage that it needs. And frankly, we are decades behind our action on biodiversity than we are on climate. Yet we all know, we rely on nature for the ecosystem services it provides for us, the clean air, the water, and for the resources that actually underpin what would be and should be a sustainable economy. Now, it's been less high profile for a number of reasons. A, we're not chairing it, but also because the whole issue of biodiversity has been really under the radar for far, far too long. And I think it's only because of COVID and people are last realising the interrelationship between managing our contact with species and the habitat encroachment that we are undertaking, that actually biodiversity is at long last, for all the wrong reasons, rightly getting the priority that it needs. But we are decades behind. The last 10 years, we have missed just about all the global targets on biodiversity. So we need the Biodiversity Convention to be as successful as COP26. As Emily said, it's in China, and that is a limitation in the sense that China will obviously want a successful outcome, but what we know from COP26 in the past and what we're learning now from how we're managing COP26 is that it requires a lot of consensus building. And for all the strengths that the Chinese approach to matters you may consider, building painstaking diplomacy, I don't think anyone would say would be the highest priority for them. It's just not the way they do business. And so if we want it to be successful, the UK is going to have to put more in terms of using our diplomatic resources and offer up our own contributions to basically say to other countries, come with us on this journey if we're going to make it a success. And just out of interest, this is maybe a fact that none of you do know. If someone does know it, please let me know in the chat. But whereas effectively everybody, every country in the world and the EU bloc are members of COP26, there is one person who is not a signatory to the CBD. And the answer is America. They are not signatories to the CBD. They come, but they're not signatories. So again, it just shows you we can't rely on them to deliver the leadership. And so again, it puts a bit more pressure on the British government, if they believe in this, to step up to the plate and lead from the front. So some would say the optics are good. The UK is the co-chair of what's called the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. It's got 60 countries. We co-chair it with Canada, and it includes people like the EU. And it's basically about setting ambition. And it's great that they want to protect 30% of the world's land and sea by 2030. That's the ambition. And we are a co-chair. So that's good. Equally, the Agricultural Act, which we had last year, which replaced quite a lot of the financial mechanisms to what was previously the CAP. And I can see Phil here, who is the master on all things CAP. But basically, they've put the funding into farming in the UK in future via a system called the Environmental Land Management System, which is about paying for public goods effectively, which if it does work as it should do, could deliver more for the environment, but that's a big if. It's good news that Zach Goldsmith is the minister on this. We may dislike the fact that he stole Richmond from the Liberal Democrats, as some of us might see it, but he is an energetic and committed minister, and that is to be applauded. And equally, the Environment Bill, which will come to the Lords on the 7th of June, would enable some setting of environmental targets. And indeed, yesterday, the government upped their ambition and agreed to commit to the biodiversity target by 2030. So, you know, got to say in that sense, hats off to them. But again, as ever with this government, there's a big but. Again, like COP26, funding is going to be critical, and people will go, I think, far more smoothly towards good targets if the funding can be offered, which can be linked to poverty alleviation, which affects a number of the poorer countries. Again, we need the G7 to facilitate that dialogue. And despite asking for the Professor Dasgupta to do a report on this, the government's sign so far is pretty weak, I think, in terms of what they're actually going to deliver. And again, this is an area, I think, even more so than COP, where the fact that we're no longer in the EU is a, excuse me, is a hindrance. Because, as I said, in this case, with the CBD, we need to mobilise a lot more of the support ourselves at a sort of a secondary level. And we can't do that as part of what we used to be able to do in the EU bloc. And I remember very clearly in the run up to Paris, I mean, Ed Davey convened a group of the Green ministers across all the EU countries and basically mobilised them to work together really strongly to get to an agreed position. And I think in terms of CBD, because we're much further behind than we are on CBD, that would have been remarkably helpful if we were in a position to have done that in this case. So I will just finish by saying what good could look like, because I think I'm running over time, so I apologise for that. What would good look like? Well, it would look like ambitious targets. We had 20 targets, which we singularly failed at the last Aichi conference. We need ambitious targets, but we also need those implementation mechanisms. We need to learn the lessons from COP26 and develop those sort of ratchet up mechanisms to make those actually work. Previously, for those of you who haven't delved into the detail of the biodiversity targets, they're so woolly, they would have been really hard to have met anyway. Secondly, we need the money, a mix of climate offsets, private finance, and some ODA funding. The scale is far less than COP26, but I think it's going to be even harder to deliver that. And frankly, the One Planet conference, which was held, I think, in February in France, the signs were pretty clear that there's really no clarity about how we get agreement on the funding for the biodiversity targets. And thirdly, we need agreement around issues which are very important to developing countries, which are around developing an agreed approach to sharing genetic resources. The whole issue of gene editing, GMOs has been sort of floating around in the background for quite some time. it really now does need to be addressed in terms of making sure that intellectual property rights are shared so that the poorer nations can get access to the scientific benefits. I think it would be very unlikely, Sally, that will get agreed at this particular COP. As I say, I think there's a better chance of progress because COVID has sadly made people more aware of the implications of not treating biodiversity with the respect. But I think it is going to be tough. So all I will say in conclusion is I'm sure all of us wish our government and all governments well at both these really important events. We are committed as Liberal Democrats, and we are committed, I think, as most of us on this call, we may not be Liberal Democrats, but we are internationalists and we believe in the power of working together. And we need to do that to ensure that we have the climate that can sustain us in the future and the nature that we need. And I hope that in the discussions that we're about to have, we can go away at the end, hopefully hopeful, even though recognising there are some incredibly big roadblocks that could stop and completely derail these two important conferences later this year. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. That was fantastic and just a lot to unpack. First, I'd like to apologize on behalf of America. Well, hopefully, maybe John Kerry will will get Joe Biden to sign the CBD this year. We can hope. And then speaking of John Kerry, he called COP26 in Glasgow humanity's last best hope. Would you agree with that statement? I think so based on everything you said, but I'd like to get your take on that.
Yes, and I do agree with him. And what I think is so, I mean, it is so fantastic to have an American administration who's now engaged with the issues, but it's also great to have John Kerry there, not only because of his expertise and the fact that he's got so many good links built up over the years. And this is so much about trust and relationship, but also he has a wonderful way with words. I mean, that is such a, it is a true statement, because if we don't start hitting the 1.5 target, if we don't get if we don't get the progress in the next decade by 2030, we just can't reach it. So it's wonderful to have a statesman who has those diplomatic skills, but also a way of engaging the public, because I mean, that's an issue we might want to touch on a bit more. At the moment, you know, and the discussion I've just given to you is incredibly sort of internationalist, techie, absolutely vital. But to deliver this, as the Climate Change Committee said, 59% of the action that is going to be needed to deliver this is people changing the way they live, what they eat, what they travel. And I thought it was very clever that, and the reason I think about that point is because John Kerry's comment at the weekend was about, you know, well, we're relying on half of this by new technology. And, you know, that's true. And some of these technologies, we've been trying to develop them for like carbon capture and storage for quite some time. But half of it is about being honest with people about how they deliver and how they change their lifestyles. And that for me is where the politicians, you know, are afraid to go, and they've got to go. They really have got to go.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. All right, let's go to some questions. We've had an apology from Alex Julius, the secretary of our business forum at the NLC. So I'll just read you the question he sent in. We know through the inspiring example of Greta Thunberg that individual actions can make an impact. What can individual small and medium-sized enterprises do right now in their everyday activities to make real contributions to mitigating climate change and improving biodiversity?
Well, that fits on very nicely from the point I was just making, that politicians aren't really engaging. They're engaging at the high level, and we're seeing a lot of initiatives with, you know, certainly around finance with the FTSE 100 and various other initiatives with the big companies. But where governments aren't really doing very much at the moment is giving practical advice to SMEs. I mean, if you remember in the run-up to Brexit, you know, there was all this advertising about what small and medium-sized enterprises needed to do in advance of Brexit. I don't think a lot of that was very helpful, but at least there was a clear recognition that they needed to start now to be communicating with SMEs to actually give them the tools so that they can start doing their own carbon accounting, so that they can start looking at in terms of how they can reduce their water intake. What are the changes that they need to be doing? So I think the government's got quite a big gap between what it's doing on leading some of the bigger companies, and for example, the fact that it's going to make disclosure of the major companies on climate issues mandatory in the near future. They're starting with the big boys and the big girls, so to speak, but they're not yet addressing what it means for SMEs, which are the bulk of companies in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so our next question is from Christopher Vlado, who's the CEO of the Paddy Ashdown Farm. Christopher, you'd like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, thank you. Bearing in mind we've got COP15 in Kunming, do you feel that gross ecosystem product within China could provide a useful template to account for the value of natural capital worldwide?
Well, two answers to that. The first is nobody has yet done a sort of a comparison, to my knowledge, of that approach with some of the other approaches that are in the sort of, I would call, nascent form. And it was very interesting when I read the Dasgupta review. I thought it might have mentioned some of the other sort of natural capital approaches out there. And to my recollection, and I have read it, I don't remember there being that. It didn't basically sort of say this is a and I'm happy for you to come back in on that. Yeah. But the Dasgupta review is basically saying at the moment what we have is a need to embed natural capital into our global decision making, but there is not an effective vocabulary to do that. And that was his conclusion. And my understanding is that they are hoping that he is going to be addressing the G7. And so my understanding is that they are hoping that he will be taking forward that initiative at that meeting. But I am not sufficiently aware of the approach in China. But as I say, I was surprised that when Dasgupta's report came out, I didn't see any sort of any comparison by him of systems that he thought would fill the gaps that he has identified, which to me suggests it doesn't work as well as it could do. But I'm happy to be contradicted, Christopher, if you'd like to come back on that.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. He obviously refers to Ostrom a great deal, and quite rightly so. And he does make a reference to GEP. I think the thing about the approach on GEP is the fact, of course, it starts to look at the decisions that are foregone, which is very interesting. So to take a very simplistic example, if you could imagine a farmer and whose main product is apples without bees, he's got a real problem. And so what you can actually do is if you actually take an approach very similar in vein to economic profit, which is a foundation behind sustainable viability, what you can actually then understand is the economic impact of the decisions that you didn't take, so the alternatives to the decisions that you do. And that way you can actually start capitalizing the value of the ecosystem services and the way that the actual natural capital actually behaves in interaction with us. Because I mean, at the end of the day, we are part of the biodiversity cycle, because we're a species as well. Only we're very good, of course, at just destroying the feedback loops, whereas in the natural world, of course, they create the feedback loops that feed each other. And that would be one. And if you're using the economic profit cycle, it can be a way of determining the value of the services.
Well, thank you for that. As I say, he didn't recommend that as the way forward, but I will now go back and just I missed the reference, so I will go back and read that.
Our next question is from the chair of the Defence and Security Circle, Noel Hatchie-Michael. Noel, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much. My question is, and that's on behalf of 40 or so members of our circle, is the United Kingdom sufficiently prepared to counter serious adversarial, hostile and enduring grey zone threats? And we're thinking of cyber and biological warfare attacks on water, air and food chain security, which all play a role in allowing us to achieve our climate ambitions.
Wow. Well, no, I can't give you an answer to that because it's certainly not an issue that we as a committee, I mean, given we've only just started, it's not an issue would be within our remit to look at, but it's a really interesting issue because if you think of all the biological threats that we've seen in the past and how much, if we're going to be increasingly reliant on ensuring the quality of our biodiversity, it's an issue we need to look at. Given you're a bit of an expert on this, I'd be very happy if you'd like to give me a briefing on that at some stage. Maybe we could meet at the National Liberal Club to do that, because I think that would be useful. It's not an area I have to say I've been sufficiently engaged with in my past, and perhaps it's something we need to focus on a bit more.
It's an interesting reality that so many defence people are actually incredibly interested in climate and green issues.
If I could just come back on that, one of the things that you're right, they are really interested in it in terms of, some of them are interested in it on the basis of threats. And also it's very interesting in terms of talking to people at the MOD about their commitment on sustainability on their own land. I mean, you know, that I think it's a third of all SSSIs in the UK are on MOD land. And if we're going to deliver the carbon offsetting budget, we're going to have the support of the MOD to do that. And as I'm sure you know, I think it's Major General Nugent who's in charge of sort of sustainability issues. So I think there is a real interest by the defence community. I'm trying not to upset them too much because we've got the Environment Bill coming up, and at the moment as it stands, the MOD has an exemption from the provisions to have regard to the government's policy statement on environmental principles, which is basically the governing principles which all ministers should take into account when they're looking at future policy areas. But there are two departments who are excluded. No prizes for guessing. The other one's Treasury. But I'm very concerned about the MOD, particularly given they are subject to the provisions in the Climate Change Act, which they have worked with very satisfactorily. And as it stands at the moment, I think it's the 2008 Natural England and Rural Communities Act. The MOD have a responsibility to have regard for biodiversity. So the government are actually weakening the MOD's interrelationship with the natural world, and I think that's wrong, and I don't think that's really, I don't think that's what the MOD people that I speak to want to have. So I'm certainly intending to pass putting an amendment to the Environment Bill to reinstate the MOD. So it would be good for me to be informed about other defence issues as well, so that I don't look too hostile, because I'm not. I'm just trying to bring them into a debate that I think they need to be and want to be in.
Really good topic, and the relationship between the MOD and climate. I think one area maybe the US kind of did step up in, the Department of Defense in the US declared the climate crisis probably the biggest emergency in the coming century. So I find that really interesting that they are working with the government and well, maybe not the past administration, but certainly this new administration. And that they recognize that the link is there and the need to examine security on that. So perhaps that might be another a talk with the Defense and Security Circle. I think that would definitely be very interesting for everyone. Okay, our next question will come from Janet Barrett. She's the former chair of the National Liberal Club. Janet, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Emily, and thank you, Kate. That was very interesting. You only touched very briefly on emissions from air travel. And everybody here, or most people, will know that I now live in Berlin, and we are expecting a general election in September. And one of the major parties now is the Green Party. And the young lady who's standing as the Chancellor candidate announced yesterday that she thought that short hop flights within countries should be banned. And there were howls of outrage about this. But given that long distance train journeys are getting much, much shorter, and they're usually much more environmentally friendly, how do you think that leads into the COP negotiations? Can we realistically hope that a lot of countries will say we mustn't have these short hop flights anymore?
Oh, well, thank you very much for that, Janet. It's very interesting also that I think this move is following on from one in France, where the French government, in response to their sort of climate assembly, which they put together, one of the parts of their climate legislation is a ban. It's now in law, a ban. I think it's any short haul flight that's less. Sorry, the journey could be done in, I think it's an hour and a half. I think that's the big the time issue. And I think we are going to have to seriously start looking at this whole issue here in the UK. It was very interesting when the government introduced their ambition target, the 78% earlier in the year. They did say for the first time that they would include aviation emissions in their calculations, which is the first time for doing so, and is to be congratulated, because so many other countries, that is the first time that anyone has said that. They haven't said, but what they haven't said is how they're going to achieve that. They are also at the moment looking at cutting air passenger duty, which would seem to be counter to the issue. We are, if I might say, in the party, because this is a fairly new issue, we are looking at it. My own view is that we have to be quite clear about the issue. I think the French proposal, as it stands, is a good one. I think if you can do a journey by another available route, then I think we are going to have to start getting tougher on flying. But equally, I think there's an issue around charging, and where if you're going to amend air passenger duty, it should be the people who are flying more frequently who are paying more. But it is a debate which needs to be had in this country. And if Germany, if the Greens do as well as they're predicted that they do, and she does implement that, and France has it, I think there will be more moves on this front. But it is then getting countries into the issue of how do we seriously engage with individuals to effectively get them to deliver those sustainable lifestyles, which is something here in the UK and elsewhere that governments have traditionally been very loath to do. For example, it equally applies on the issue of food. The Climate Change Committee's recommendations on the 6th carbon budget say that it requires a cut in meat and dairy by 2035 of 20%. Well, the government haven't said whether they'll accept that or not, but addressing and informing the public about what needs to be done in terms of sustainable choices around the food is as important as tackling issues around aviation.
Maybe a slightly related question from Lee. Lee, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question. Oh, sorry, Lee, we're not able to hear you.
How's that?
Perfect.
Lovely. Good to be with you all again, and thank you, Emily, for letting me ask a question. You thought to apologise for the US before. I thought if we start apologising for the UK, we're going to be here a very long time, aren't we? Yes, thank you, Kate. I was last with the group here on World Health Day, and clearly we know that we can't have healthy people without healthy planet. So this is certainly linked. My question for you, and thank you for your great overview. My question is about carbon offsetting. We've seen a lot of the statistics, a lot of the research now is showing that the figures we thought were valid are not really valid after all. Part of my day job is around sustainability, and it's a big challenge to get people to understand that if you printed a big document, planting a tree doesn't magically offset it. So should we get rid of or stop talking about offsetting because we really need people to start cutting their embodied carbon and their core emissions?
Well, we do need people to start cutting their core emissions. We need to reduce the global footprint, and there is a very real danger that the focus by our government and others on offsetting, and the big sort of buzzword at COP26 is nature-based solutions, which is all about, oh, well, if we can't quite manage to get the investment to deliver the technological change we want, then we need to upweight offsetting through peat restoration, through planting trees, and although it's not yet quite as clear how we do it, through the carbon capture and storage facilities that are in blue carbon, which is in our seeds. So we can't get to where we need to. We can't get to 1.5 if we just do offsetting, and there is a real danger that the politicians talking about increasing offsetting is to give them cover for not investing in the new areas of research that are desperately needed. Having said that, as someone who is interested in both climate and biodiversity, I do not, or rather I am pleased that nature-based solutions are getting the focus they need, because it helps deliver biodiversity targets if you plant the right trees of the right type in the right location. But you're right to raise it, because as it stands at the moment, there is a real danger that everyone will say we can meet our targets if we get this, if we get these offsets sorted. And it's absolutely crystal clear we've got to reduce our global consumption.
I'm aware it's nearly 7. I hope it's okay with you, Kate, if we overrun by just a few minutes. We have 3 questions remaining. If we could squeeze those in. Fantastic. Craig Davidson had a question. Craig, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for this evening, Emily. So clearly from the uniform, I've just got in from work. I work as a nurse in health and social care, and we use many plastic single-use items. Not only that, we don't routinely recycle. With the NHS being the UK's biggest employer, how do you think that we can address this really significant issue? And then more a point of comment, also global health wise, we know that climate change is going to significantly affect increase in pollution, which is going to increase respiratory problems, but also drought and famine. So how do you think we can address these issues, both as the UK, but also internationally working in collaboration?
Yeah, well, it's great to have you with us, Craig. I bet you're absolutely shattered. So it's really lovely to hear your thoughts. Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, plastics are ubiquitous. And in terms of in medical settings, there are situations where it's really hard to see, certainly by 2030, that there's going to be viable alternatives. We need more investment in alternatives, but it is quite clear that by 2030, we will still be having a significant amount of plastics in medical settings. And the government, although they're saying, well, we've banned cotton buds and we've banned, stirrers in plastic stirrers, they're not seriously enough addressing the issues of how we as a country invest in finding alternatives. Equally, to their credit, they are proposing a tax on plastics in future which don't have a content, I think it's 30% recycled plastic in it, so that may help in some ways. But the Environment Bill, all it's proposing on plastics is a deposit return scheme, which again addresses those sort of very, they're not easy, but the single-use plastics. They don't address the critical investment that's needed in plastics in the medical field. And equally, and I say this, how shall I put this? Clearly the health service has to focus on people's health at the moment, but there has been far too little focus in the past, both in terms of procurement and in terms of circular economy in the NHS, in terms of making sure that recycling is done in an efficient way. So there is far more progress that needs to be done in that arena. You raised the equally important point, which I didn't touch on at all, partly because of time, which is the people who are going to be most affected by climate change are the people in the developing countries. And it's, you know, it's going to be shortages of water, it's going to be heat, which is going to have a critical impact on the health, on their, and managing the health, the infrastructure to support that health. And so it's an area that hasn't received the attention that it needs. And I was saying to colleagues in advance of this meeting that it's very good to see this week that the WHO has just launched, I think it was possibly on Monday, but just launched a new initiative with the London School of Tropical Hygiene, looking whole new work stream on the issue of climate and health in developing nations, because we've absolutely not given it the priority that it needs. And again, this is an area where the cuts to our ODA budget, which will impact on health and the health infrastructure in developing countries, will be, will be severely tested.
Our next question is from Tamiz Khan. Tamiz, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, I was wondering, are we going to focus on the medicinal plants, which is also going to be rare and endangered in many parts of the world?
Sorry, could you repeat your question? I've lost you on my screen, so I didn't quite catch that.
Well, my question was on focusing on medicinal plants. Are we interested in conservation of the medicinal plants also?
I'm not sure exactly how I could have addressed that point. What particularly would you be hoping for us to focus on?
Well, medicinal plants are also endangered and rare in many parts of the world. So medicinal plants help us in getting medicines. So are we going to focus on conservation of the medicinal plants?
Yes. No, sorry, I can't see your face on my screen, so I apologise that I wasn't. It shows, it makes it quite, it's quite interesting actually, seeing someone, hearing what they're saying. Yeah, well, when I looked at what the World Health Organization are proposing, it isn't at the moment an issue that they're specifically looking at. And it may well be that the 20 targets that are set by the CBD in October would look at particular areas of concern. They have done that in the past. So medicinal plants, which as you rightly say are an issue we should be focusing on given their importance to us, might be an area that they would pick up. I can't give you an answer as to whether or not that's been looked at so far. I think the open-ended working group had its last meeting last month, but that's certainly something I'll ask through my committee if there's any particular targets around medicinal plants.
Great. Okay. And I guess fittingly, our last question is from Subbu Loganathan, who will also be doing the vote of thanks. So I guess you can just sort of tie that into what you're going to ask.
Great. Thanks, Emily, and thanks so much, Baroness Kate, for this talk. My question was actually related to what I think Lee mentioned earlier, because we work with corporations on sustainable finance and ESG commitments, and you see a lot of corporations with carbon offsets, net zero pledges, but what is essentially greenwashing. How can we make sure companies stay true to their pledges while we're talking about governments staying true to their pledges?
It's a really good point, because there is going to be an increasing amount of greenwashing. I don't know how many of you read the FT, but you can't actually have a day go by without some other company having a new net zero target. It's almost like someone's sort of added it just before AOB on sort of corporate board meetings. And there is a real danger, and it's an issue that sort of Lee was touching on when he raised the issue of offsetting. You know, who are the guardians of these standards? And as it stands at the moment, because there's no global agreed mechanisms for these ESG standards, it is very difficult to tell who is doing things properly and who isn't. It's great that the Americans have now started getting interested in ESG. That's great, but we need very clear and preferably international standards. I have to say, I am quite hopeful. I'm really hopeful that once Mark Carney has finished his ambassadorial work around COP26, I don't know if any of you have read his latest book, but I get the sense that this might be something that he might think he could credibly take forward with the task force in terms of identifying a way to get a globally agreed system around ESG. We would have to have national bodies which would then do sort of national accounting, but we do need those standards to be global. That's on the climate side. I mean, and as I said, in the UK, we soon will be mandating the big companies to do climate-related financial disclosure. What we need is a similar approach on nature. And my understanding is that in July, I think there's going to be a new body set up, effectively mirroring the task force on climate, on a task force on nature, which the UK government has signed up to along with the Dutch and the French, I think. But we are a long way behind, because it's hard enough accounting for carbon, but it's much harder when you're trying to talk about, and Phil and others will know a lot more about this than I do, how do you account, about the soil? It's not just, it's location specific as well as being challenging in itself. So there are some big challenges, but we need to get some globally agreed frameworks in place. And I would hope that coming out of COP26, that is one of the big things that we could see movement on, so that we can immediately start to tackle the issue of what will become massive greenwash unless we really start to tackle it very quickly.
Thank you.
So, Subo, I think time for your vote of thanks.
Great. Thanks, Emily, and thank you so much, Baroness Kate, for such an insightful talk with a clear overview of the challenges and also the urgent actions that we need to do to meet our climate change objectives. It's also refreshing to learn about the Biodiversity Conference, which, as you know, is so important for a sustainable future. I would also like to thank Emily Robinson for being an excellent chair for the event, and applaud Trevor Peel, chair of the NLC Commonwealth and European Forum, for organizing the event. At this point, I'd just like to talk about our next event, which is on the 11th of June, which is hopefully a hybrid in-person and Zoom event at the club. And especially Baroness Kate, if you're free, we would love to welcome you to the club at that date. To mark the Queen's birthday observed, and in conjunction with the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, we'll be planning an event focusing on human ecology and sustainable development.